At dawn, the camp did not breathe. 185,000 tents, and not a single cough, not a single boot-scraping leather, not the lazy rattle of dice in a soldier's palm. Banners that had bragged all summer hung like tongues that finally learned shame. Cook fires still glowed, but no one stirred them. Spoons rested in bowls of barley gone to stone. Flies arrived first, punctual as priests. From the walls of Jerusalem, men stared into a silence big enough to swallow an empire. Last night, the Assyrian host had been a city of iron, drums in the dust, bronze that sang each time it was lifted, laughter heavy with conquest. They spoke of Nineveh's rivers and the lions carved on palace walls. They boasted that no god had ever withstood them, so why should this one? Their champion had spit his challenge toward the gates and named the Holy One a local deity, useful for feasts, helpless in war. The crowd loved the line. Blasphemy travels well when the wine is good. Somewhere in the king's house, a letter lay open on a table. It said surrender dressed as reason. It said inevitable with the confidence of a man who has never lost. It called faith a superstition and mercy a delay. Its seal, once whole, was cracked clean through like a sneer cut in wax. That was last night. Now, quiet. An empire had misplaced its heartbeat. On the nearest ridge, the royal scribes counted in whispers, as if numbers could wake the dead. Rows of bodies under awnings, faces tilted toward a sky that refused to look back. Helmets lay where heads should have been. Swords pointed at nothing. The sand wore the impression of knees that hadn't knelt in years. They called it plague when their mouths finally found a word. But the air smelled too clean for rot. No fever mist hung in the low places. No rasping chorus crept tent to tent. Whatever had walked the lines had not panted. It had not stumbled. It had not needed the courtesy of time. It moved like a sentence already passed. Inside the city, the king tore his robe the way a man rips open a wound to let the truth bleed. He had carried that letter to the temple and spread it like a map in front of an invisible throne. He did not bargain. He did not list virtues. He said, in the voice of a man who finally understands proportion, "They have insulted you." Then he waited, which is another kind of courage. A moth circled the oil lamp beside the letter, tracing the edge of the cracked seal again and again, as if reading. On its wings, ash so fine it looked like light. Remember the moth. Beyond the walls, the last breeze of evening had carried the smell of camphor and cooked meat from the Assyrian kitchens. A boy on night watch tasted the spice in the wind and thought of hunger. He blinked and the air changed. The taste turned thin, metallic, like water from a knife. Then the breeze stopped as cleanly as a throat cut. Some said a sound followed, too soft to be thunder, too ordered to be chance, like 1,000 reeds breathing once and never again. When morning found them, it found them all. The general, with his hand still on the campaign map. The archer curled around his bow like a lover. The drummer slumped over a skin that remembered the last beat and would not give it back. The messenger who had mocked the name lay with lips parted, as if the last thing he tried to say was, "Wait." The city did not cheer. You do not applaud a hand you cannot see. On the wall, a captain held his breath until it hurt, and then let it go in a hiss that sounded like prayer. "It wasn't a storm," he said. "Storms shout." He looked at the king's runners, already racing down the steps with orders to hold the gates shut. "This," he swallowed, "this was a thought." Down in the temple, the letter still lay open. The moth finally settled on its cracked seal and beat its wings once, twice, dusting the blasphemy with something like snow. The flame did not flicker, the air did not stir. The priest who watched had no words for the feeling that slid behind his ribs and sat there, patient as winter. By noon, the crows learned the path to the plain. By afternoon, the first brave fools suggested looting. By evening, someone whispered the name the story would keep, the angel, Do not picture feathers. Do not picture a man. Picture a verdict. Hezekiah, Smen, unbarred the smallest gate and stepped out as if walking onto a sea that might remember how to drown. Sand cracked under sandals. The nearest tent waited with its curtain frowning. On one table, a bronze idol with a lion's face drooled candle wax like melted arrogance. The captain reached to touch it and pulled back as though the metal still burned. Words did this, someone said. No, words invited it. Pride welcomed it. The letter held the door. At sunset, the sky went the color of old copper. The king stood on the wall and did not lift his hands. He had learned something about silence. He looked toward the valley of bodies and then toward the open letter. He did not smile. In the alleys behind him, children learned how softly awe can walk. By nightfall, the scribes had finished their sums. The number they wrote looked indecent on a page. The empire had promised that no god would save Jerusalem. They were wrong. Would you have bowed to the letter or torn it in half? Long before the silence, before the feather drifted across the corpses, the Assyrians believed noise was proof of life. Their cities roared with iron wheels, the crush of slaves and the music of conquest. To them, sound was dominion made flesh. They had taken the world one scream at a time. The king, Sennacherib, son of Sargon, rode at the center of that storm. His chariot axles gleamed with gold, stolen from temples that no longer existed. Every city that had tried to stand was now a cautionary tale, retold at feasts between gulps of wine. He had made himself a god of logistics. His empire ran on fear and mathematics. How many men per mile? How much grain per head? How many skulls to stack for a proper warning? The world loved his order. Order, they said, is just terror in uniform. From the walls of Jerusalem, the Assyrian heralds came like actors to a stage. They stood where the whole city could hear and shouted insults in Hebrew so even the children would understand. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, they cried. Has any god ever delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? The words hit the stones and bounced back hollow, but the soldiers laughed anyway. The laughter had weight. It was the sound of men convinced the universe was predictable. Inside the gates, Hezekiah's advisors trembled, torn between faith and arithmetic. One whispered, "They are right. They have never lost." Another muttered, "But we have never prayed like this before." Down the hill, the Assyrian tents shone like scales of a living beast. Fires spread in a neat grid, each identical to the next. Even the gods of war seemed to salute that geometry. In the king's tent, Sennacherib unrolled a parchment. Reports from his captains, tallies of tribute, sketches of battering rams ready to strike Jerusalem's gates. A slave fanned him with peacock feathers, careful not to speak. "Tomorrow," the king said, "we finish this hill of prophets." His generals nodded. They all knew the plan: break their walls, desecrate their temple, teach their God the value of silence. He lifted his cup. "They call their city holy," he smirked. "By morning it will be ordinary." Outside, the wind hissed through the banners, as if disagreeing. The next day, while Jerusalem prayed, the Assyrians celebrated the eve of victory. Priests of Nisroch, their hawk-faced god, burned oil and chanted hymns that promised dominion forever. They painted their shields with blood to keep misfortune away. One soldier laughed that the blood looked too thin, too easy to dry. A prophet inside Jerusalem heard the echo of that chant and shuddered. Isaiah, wrapped in rough cloth, whispered to the king, "He will not enter this city, nor shoot an arrow here. The Lord will defend it." Outside the walls, the heralds laughed again. "Your prophet promises safety," one mocked. "Then let him feed your children when the gates fall." The laughter carried far. The echo bounced off the hills, twisting until it sounded less like triumph and more like something testing its own reflection. At dusk, Sennacherib climbed the rise that faced Jerusalem. The city was small, stubborn, almost beautiful in its defiance. He watched the sunset ignite the temple roof in gold. So much beauty, he murmured, wasted on a lie. His chief advisor, a man named Nabu-Sharu, nodded. Their god hides behind poetry. Yours rides with armies. The king smiled. Exactly. A servant approached, holding the letter. Shall I send it now, my king? Send it, he said, and make sure they read it out loud. The messenger went up to the wall and shouted again, this time holding the parchment high. This is what the great king, the king of Assyria, says. Do not let your God deceive you. The people did not answer. The silence made him uneasy. In the temple, Hezekiah took the letter and spread it before the altar. He said nothing for a long while. The only sound was his breath, breaking once, twice. Outside, the Assyrian soldiers drank and told stories of other sieges. They spoke of gods that bled, of idols that fell, of women who begged to be spared and were not. Their laughter rose like smoke. They called him the Lion of Nineveh. He was only a man, and somewhere beyond the fires, a single feather drifted through the air, black against the orange glow. No one saw it land. How many of you have seen power mock faith? The letter arrived wrapped in arrogance. Its parchment was smooth, its seal unbroken, the ink still wet enough to gleam like blood in the lamplight. The courier bowed only halfway before thrusting it toward the guards. For your king, he said, and his smirk said the rest. If your God is listening, let him read this too. They brought it through the narrow streets where sandals scraped dust from old stones and children hid behind doorways. No one touched it longer than they had to. Even paper can carry poison if pride writes the words. Inside the palace, Hezekiah stood beside the window that faced the Mount of Olives. He had not slept. The city had been praying all night, the kind of praying that sounds like weeping and hunger more than song. When they told him the message had come, he said only, "Bring it." He broke the seal himself. The wax cracked like ice. His eyes moved over the words, "Do not let your God deceive you. Have the gods of other nations rescued them? Where are the kings of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena and Ivvah? They are gone, and so will you be." He read it twice. The first time as a king, the second as a man. Then he folded the parchment very carefully and whispered, "This is not a letter to me." Without his crown, without his robe, he walked out of the palace. The guards followed for a few steps and then stopped because they understood that some paths a man walks alone. He climbed the hill toward the temple of the Lord. The sun was high, too bright for eyes that had stared at fear too long. Inside the gates, the priests looked up from their offerings, startled. Kings do not enter barefoot. Kings do not come with dust in their hair. But Hezekiah did. He went straight to the inner court, where the great curtains breathed incense and oil. He unrolled the letter and spread it on the floor. "Lord," he said softly, "this insult is not mine. It is yours." The words echoed through the marble like a tremor. Outside, the Assyrians laughed again. They were always laughing. They sharpened their blades, sang their war songs, toasted their invincibility. Each noise was a brick in the wall of their certainty, but certainty is fragile when heaven listens. Isaiah came without being called. He was old now, his beard white, his eyes sharp enough to see the end of empires. He entered the temple quietly, like someone answering a sound others could not hear. When he saw the parchment on the floor, he smiled without joy. "So he wrote again," Isaiah said. "Men who cannot lift their eyes always lift their pens." Hezekiah turned. "He mocks the Holy One. And he will learn that names are heavier than walls," the prophet said. They prayed, not for victory, but for remembrance, that heaven would not let blasphemy become the last word on earth. The prophet's voice rose, "O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, who dwells between the cherubim, you alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. Incline your ear and hear, open your eyes and see. Hear the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to reproach the living God." The silence that followed was immense, the kind that feels alive. When they left the temple, a wind had begun, thin, silver, almost shy. It wound between the towers, fluttered the curtains, lifted dust from the courtyard. Isaiah paused on the steps and looked east toward the enemy camp. His pupils caught the sunlight like small fires. "Before morning," he said, "the arrogant will sleep and not awaken." Hezekiah's breath caught. I mean what I said," Isaiah replied. "He has heard." That night the city kept watch. Mothers rocked children with dry throats. Men sharpened spears they knew they would never use. Even the dogs grew quiet, as if waiting for something larger than hunger. In the Assyrian camp, torches danced over iron. The king dined under a canopy of silk, wine staining his lips. "Tell me," he said, "how many gods fell this year?" 23, answered Nabusharu. "Then tomorrow will be 24. They laughed. The laughter was hollow, but they didn't notice. A servant outside the tent shivered though the air was still. He looked up. Clouds moved without wind. Shadows lengthened without torches. Something was walking between the tents. Something that made no sound, no dust, no sense. The soldier drew his blade, though courage had already left him. The metal caught no reflection. He blinked once, and the night blinked back. Far on the wall, a sentry in Jerusalem saw the first torch fall, then another, then 100. Each flame vanished the moment it touched the ground. By midnight, the desert was breathing differently. The stars dimmed. The earth seemed to flinch. In the palace, Hezekiah woke suddenly. The air pressed against his chest as if a storm had entered the room without wind. Somewhere, a voice whispered, not in words, but in understanding, "It is enough." He rose, trembling, and whispered to the empty darkness, "Then let the world remember mercy." And outside, unseen, something moved through the valley like thought made flesh. No blade drawn, no cry heard, only the sound of breath leaving the lungs of an empire. What would you do if your enemy's arrogance became his prayer? The first man to die never saw it coming. He was sharpening his sword near the tent flap, half drunk, humming the same marching song that had followed him from Nineveh to the gates of Jerusalem. He thought the faint shimmer in the air was heat. Then his chest refused its next breath, and the song ended mid-note. No one heard him fall. Across the plain, the Assyrian camp lay like a sleeping beast. 185,000 soldiers in perfect order, fires flickering, banners slapping idly against the dusk. The smell of roasted meat hung thick. Someone laughed about what they would do to Jerusalem's walls at sunrise. Someone else sang about victory. They called it the lull before glory. They were right about the lull. At the edge of the camp, the wind turned. It did not gust or howl. It simply reversed direction, as if inhaling. Tents shifted slightly. Ropes tightened, and the torches bent backward, their flames flattening to thin white lines. Horses stamped once, twice, and then went still, eyes wide, ears pressed flat. The silence that followed was not peace. It was precision. From the wall of Jerusalem, a watchman leaned forward. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Another guard squinted. "See what?" "The torches. They're going out." One by one they were, not snuffed, not extinguished by wind, simply erased, like ink pulled back into the quill that wrote it. Inside the Assyrian tents the men stirred. A few muttered that the air felt wrong. One soldier reached for his cup and found his hand trembling so violently he spilled the wine. It smelled metallic now, not sweet. He wiped his fingers and the cloth came away black. Something was walking between the tents. No shape, no light. Only the pressure of absence, the sense that a thought was passing close enough to touch. Men woke in confusion, gasping. Some called for water, others for their gods, but their gods did not answer because the air itself had been claimed. An officer shouted orders. His voice cracked halfway through a command, turned to a rasp, then nothing. He clawed at his throat, eyes bulging. The soldier beside him drew back in terror and saw that the officer's face had gone pale as chalk, veins blackening like roots spreading under his skin. "Plague!" someone screamed. But plague does not move this fast. The first rows of tents collapsed inward, ropes snapping. The men inside fell without a sound. Their shadows burned faintly into the canvas before vanishing. Horses broke loose, bolting in circles until they too stumbled. The smell changed again, no longer metal but rain on stone, the scent that comes before lightning. And yet the sky was clear. Far above, the stars blinked. One disappeared entirely. In Jerusalem, Isaiah woke before anyone knocked. He sat upright in the darkness, heart steady. He had heard this silence once before, long ago, when Egypt drowned. He stood, wrapped himself in his cloak and said aloud to the night, "It is done." Hezekiah, miles away, was already on his knees. The palace walls trembled as though something enormous had passed over them. Lamps flickered but did not die. Outside, every dog began to howl in the same breath, then stopped just as suddenly. No one in the city slept again. In the camp, time stopped counting. A sentry by the outer wall of tents dropped his spear and tried to run, but his legs folded under him like wet cloth. His last thought was of home, a courtyard, a woman grinding grain, the smell of figs. He tried to speak her name. The air refused him. By the third hour of night, the only sounds were fabric settling and armor cooling. The presence that had moved through them left no footprints. It did not gloat. It simply departed, carrying with it the echo of one truth: you mocked what breathes you. When the dawn finally crawled over the horizon, it found the Assyrian plain gleaming strangely, as though frost had fallen in summer. Every tent still stood, every banner still waved, but beneath them, stillness. The first birds that landed on the ropes flew off again, startled. From the city wall, the watchman saw it first. "They're not moving," one whispered. Hezekiah came to the parapet himself, robe hastily tied, eyes raw from prayer. He looked out over the valley at the sea of tents that should have been swarming with life. The air was too clean. No smoke rose. "Send men to see," he said. The scouts went out at midday, cautious, hands tight on their spears. They crossed the line of shields and did not meet a single living soul. They entered the first tent and froze. Inside, two men sitting upright, eyes open, skin the color of salt. Between them, a dice cup still mid-toss. They checked another tent, then another, all the same, not burned, not wounded. Simply gone, emptied of motion, of sound, of will. When the scouts returned, one vomited before he could speak. Another dropped to his knees. Finally, the captain managed a single sentence. "They're all dead." "How many?" the king asked. The man's voice cracked. "All of them, every last one." Hezekiah closed his eyes. "Then the letter is answered." By dusk, the wind came back, gentle now, stirring the dust over the corpses like a hand smoothing a page. The valley breathed again, faintly. The silence remained, but it had changed. It was no longer the hush of terror. It was the pause after justice. If silence could kill pride, would we still dare to speak? When the sun rose, it did not rise gently. It came up like a blade unsheathed, slicing the horizon into gold and blood. The first rays touched the Assyrian camp, and where light should have awakened life, it revealed the absence of it. From the city walls, the watchmen stared in disbelief. The camp stretched endlessly, thousands upon thousands of tents, but no movement, no soldiers stoking fires, no armor clinking, no voices shouting the morning roll. Only stillness, so complete that even the desert seemed to hold its breath. "Perhaps they march at dawn," one guard murmured, clinging to the logic of survival. But dawn had already come, and the army that had terrified nations lay quieter than dust. The scouts returned pale and trembling, eyes wide with the kind of knowledge that never leaves a man. "They're dead," one whispered. "All of them." The words fell into the silence like pebbles into a bottomless well. Hezekiah stood at the rampart, looking toward the valley. The air shimmered faintly above the sand, a ghost of heat, but nothing moved below. He whispered, "How can so many die in one night?" Beside him, Isaiah's cloak rustled in the wind. "Because life was never theirs," he said. The king turned. Then whose was it? The prophet's gaze did not waver. The one they mocked. They descended the wall together, followed by guards who still glanced behind them as if the silence might break into shouting again. The gates opened cautiously, hinges groaning, and the smell met them first, a scent like iron and rain, sharp and clean, as if the earth had been scoured by fire and then washed by tears. The soldiers walked through rows of tents. Inside, men sat as though asleep, heads bowed, hands frozen mid-gesture. Cups of wine rested on tables, dice scattered across rugs. One man still clutched a half-eaten date between his fingers. Their faces bore no wounds, no marks of violence, only a faint pallor, a bluish dusting across their lips, as if the breath had left them peacefully. But the peace was a lie. A captain kneeled, pressing his ear to a soldier's chest. Nothing, not even the echo of a heartbeat. When he touched the man's hand, it crumbled like sand. He jerked back. "My lord," he said, voice breaking, "they are hollow." Hezekiah entered the king's tent last. Sennacherib's throne, a carved chair of cedar and gold, stood empty. The cushions were undisturbed, the goblet still upright, the map of Jerusalem pinned under a dagger. But the dagger's blade was blackened, as though it had absorbed the night itself. "Where is the king?" someone asked. No one answered. Isaiah brushed his fingers over the map. The ink of the siege lines had bled outward, turning the parchment grey. "He has seen what becomes of boasting," the prophet murmured. Outside, the breeze began to move again, timid, cautious, like a servant entering a room it feared. The banners trembled once, then fell still again. Even the flies avoided the bodies. By midday, the news spread through Jerusalem like water over stone. People poured into the streets, laughing and weeping in the same breath. The sound of disbelief turned to song. Women threw open their windows and shouted praises to the sky. Children ran to the rooftops, waving scraps of cloth as though they could greet the unseen hand that had saved them. The priests gathered in the temple, voices rising in unison. "The Lord has done it," they cried. "He has broken the spear and burned the chariot in the fire." Hezekiah did not celebrate. He stood at the city gate, watching the horizon shimmer over the valley of the dead. "Is this mercy," he asked quietly, "or warning?" Isaiah looked toward the same horizon. "Both," he said. "Mercy for those who remember, warning for those who will forget." The king nodded slowly. "Then men will forget soon." "They always do," the prophet replied. That night, while the city rejoiced, Hezekiah sat alone in the courtyard. The stars above seemed closer than before, their light sharp and unblinking. He held the Assyrian letter in his hand, the one that had mocked his faith, and tore it into pieces. The fragments drifted into a basin of oil, caught flame, and vanished into smoke. As he watched the fire die, he thought he heard something beyond the city walls, a faint hum, low and steady, like wind remembering where it had passed. He whispered to it, though he knew it could not hear him. "Thank you." Far out on the plain, unseen by any man, a single feather lay half buried in the sand. It gleamed faintly in the moonlight, silver, weightless, impossible. The wind lifted it once, then let it fall again. By morning, it was gone. The scribes who recorded the event would later write that one angel slew 185,000 men in a single night. But the truth was simpler. Pride suffocated itself, and silence finished the work. From then on, travelers avoided that valley. They said the air there was too still, the earth too clean. Some claimed to hear faint breathing in the sand when the wind passed over it. Others said the ground sang quietly, not in grief, but remembrance. And sometimes, when the desert turned white with moonlight, a whisper rose among the dunes. You mocked what breathes you. Would you have believed it was an angel, or would you have called it coincidence? Centuries pass quickly when the desert is your witness. Empires rise, dig for gold, and leave their bones behind. But the wind stays loyal to memory. The Valley of the Dead became a name whispered by shepherds, then dismissed by scholars, then rediscovered by explorers who believed every silence hides a secret worth selling. No one remembered the night the angel walked through tents like breath through reeds, but the ground remembered. When the sun hit it just right, the sand near Lachish shimmered differently, silver, almost glassy. Farmers ploughing nearby said their oxen refused to step there. The earth is too light, they said, as if something beneath it is hollow. Then came the archaeologists. They arrived with notebooks and skepticism, sunburned men who laughed easily and believed only in things that bled when cut. They had heard rumors of an Assyrian field, a patch of land where nothing grew though the soil was rich. They thought it superstition, until their compasses began to spin. The first excavation unearthed a layer of black sand unlike anything in the region. Mixed in were fragments of bronze, fused as if melted without fire. One shard bore the faint impression of cuneiform, another the curved edge of what might have been a helmet, welded seamlessly to a jawbone. Dr. Langston, the lead archaeologist, stared at the find for a long time before speaking. "This isn't battle," he said quietly. "It's precision." That night the desert wind changed direction. The workers huddled in their tents, whispering about the strange cold that descended after sunset. They said they heard breathing from the ground, a slow rhythm that made their lamps flicker in time. One man claimed he saw a pale light moving under the sand, like something alive. Another found his footprints glowing faintly hours after he'd walked. Langston wrote in his journal, "There is no sound here, and yet my ears ring. The silence hums." He didn't sleep again after that. On the fifth day, a local guide brought him an old parchment from a monastery nearby, fragments of the Book of Isaiah, copied centuries ago. He pointed to a line with his trembling finger. "Then the angel of the Lord went forth, and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 180 and 5,000. Langston laughed, but his voice cracked. "My dear friend," he said, "that's myth, not data." The guide smiled without humor. "Then stop digging." He didn't. On the sixth night, the camp awoke to a noise like distant thunder. Though the sky was clear, the generator lights flickered and died. The sand began to vibrate softly, each grain trembling as if remembering an old command. The team rushed outside, shouting, flashlights sweeping across the dunes. Then they saw it. A faint glow spread beneath the surface, white and slow-moving, tracing invisible paths through the excavation site. Curves and spirals that pulsed like veins. It gathered near the largest trench, where the black sand lay exposed. One worker screamed, "It's breathing!" And maybe it was. Langston grabbed his camera, but the lens fogged instantly. The air felt dense, heavy, metallic. He tried to shout orders, but his voice sounded far away, like it was coming from someone else's throat. The glow grew brighter, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was unbearable, so thick that everyone felt their hearts slow to match it. And then it was gone. When morning came, 3 tents were empty. No footprints led away. The sand inside each was perfectly smooth, as though brushed by invisible hands. Langston's journal was found half buried outside his tent. The final line read, "It wasn't lightning, it was memory." The excavation was abandoned. The report filed to the British Museum called it an unfortunate accident during a sandstorm. The site was sealed, then forgotten again. But the locals still talk about it. They say the valley hums at night when the wind is right. They say the dunes glow faintly under a new moon. Some even say they see shapes walking. Tall, pale figures that vanish when you blink, leaving only the faint sound of feathers brushing the sand. Modern scholars call it geologic luminescence. Pilgrims call it the angel's breath. Both are right. And sometimes, when tourists camp too close, their recordings capture something else, a whisper carried faintly on the wind. The sword that slays pride does not sleep. Would you still call it legend if the ground beneath you started to breathe? If you stand in that valley today, you won't see bones. You'll see wind, you'll hear nothing. But if you wait long enough, if you let the noise of the world bleed out of your ears until silence itself starts to have texture, you might feel something shift beneath your feet. At first it feels like vibration, like a drumbeat too deep to be heard. Then you realize it's not the ground moving, it's memory. Satellite maps mark the place as an unremarkable stretch of desert near the ruins of Lachish. Historians argue over whether the numbers were exaggerated. 185,000 can't be right, they say. Plague, famine, panic, all more reasonable. They talk about bacteria, not angels. They mention coincidence, not consequence. But the valley doesn't care what name you give it. It knows what it saw. At night, the air there still glows faintly blue, not from any radiation or gas, but from the sand itself. Each grain, fused long ago by impossible heat, catches moonlight differently, like the faint shimmer of wings mid-flight. The locals call it the field of sleep. Pilgrims come with jars to collect the dust. Scientists come with instruments. Both leave with silence in their throats. A documentary team once filmed there for a week. On the second night, the director woke screaming that he'd heard breathing under his tent. The audio captured only wind, but the sound engineer swore the static on the track had rhythm, 4 slow beats, then a pause, like lungs remembering. They left before dawn. Every few years, someone comes claiming to have solved the mystery. Carbon dioxide pockets, sonic vibrations, magnetic anomalies. They write reports, publish papers, hold lectures filled with confidence, but even their recordings betray them. Somewhere between frequencies, always the same pattern, a low hum, steady, patient, familiar. It's the sound of a lesson refusing to die, because this was never about one night or one army. It was about the disease that spreads faster than plague. Pride, the quiet arrogance that builds walls higher than prayers, the certainty that safety belongs to those who shout loudest. That was Assyria's true illness. It still is the world's. The Assyrians built their empire on conquest, numbers, noise. They thought power meant permanence. They learned otherwise in a single night, when silence chose sides. But silence is patient. It waits. It returns. Every age builds its own Assyria. Today, it wears different names: technology, control, progress. Cities pulse with light while compassion starves in the shadows. Empires build weapons faster than empathy. Kings no longer boast in letters to Jerusalem. They boast in data and dominance. But the melody is the same. And somewhere beyond our senses and statistics, the hum remains, a warning that mercy, when ignored, becomes a blade. If you walk through that valley, you'll see mirages ripple across the glassed earth. Some look like armies, others like angels, sometimes both. No one knows which is which anymore. An old monk who once visited the site wrote in his diary, "It's not the dead who haunt this place. It's what killed them." When he returned to his monastery, he refused to speak for the rest of his life. A researcher from Tel Aviv collected samples of the fused soil. Under electron microscopy, she found patterns, microscopic grooves forming concentric circles. Like vibration marks, she said, as if sound solidified. Her paper ended with a single sentence: "Some frequencies are not meant to be measured," and yet We keep trying. We always do. Because humans cannot resist the temptation to touch what silence protects. We call it curiosity. The old texts call it defiance. But listen closely, really listen, and you'll hear that hum again. It doesn't come from beneath, it comes from within. It's the sound of a conscience we keep burying under comfort. You might think the story of 185,000 dead men is about divine anger. It isn't. It's about divine patience, about how many warnings we ignore before silence must speak again. That's why the ground still glows. That's why the wind still hums. That's why the valley still breathes. Because the angel never left. It only changed its form. Now it lives in hesitation, the pause before cruelty, the shiver before pride, the whisper before denial. The angel's sword isn't metal anymore. It's memory. It waits in every human heart, asking the same question that echoed through that camp thousands of years ago. How many times will you challenge mercy before it stops answering? If you ever go there, don't speak, don't take pictures, don't test the air, just stand still, let the silence reach you. And when it does, when the hum brushes your skin and makes your heartbeat stumble, remember this. The story isn't ancient. It's ongoing. You can still hear the angel's breath in the wind if you listen carefully enough. Not punishment, not vengeance, just reminder. Have you ever mistaken survival for favor? Would you recognize mercy if it came without sound? And if silence spoke again tonight, would you listen? The hum continues. It always does.